My name is Nat and welcome to Thursday. Every Thursday we do enlightening webinars on neurodivergence. One part of neurodiversity is looking at different ways of processing information. One way that is typically mentioned is dyslexia. And within dyslexia, that is just one of a selection of reading disorders. We're going to be looking at what are the other reading disorders that aren't just dyslexia. You may be more closely aligned to one of those than dyslexia, or maybe a little bit mixed and a bit hybrid. As I always say, as an organization, we predominantly specialize in things like dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, and ADHD, but there are way more different neurodevelopmental or processing conditions, disorders, and differences out there. We talk about them far less because, I don't know, maybe less diagnosis, less awareness, but I think understanding them can definitely help you. Here's a picture of me if you're wondering, what does this geezer know about reading disorders? The fact that I've got half a dozen of them is probably more relevant than anything. I was diagnosed with dyslexia, I think officially 16, but people knew I had dyslexia much earlier on. We got Bleak and we got Daniela. Great to have you both. We got them for 7 weeks, so fingers crossed you'll get used to them. Say hi, make them feel welcome. From the old US of A, but they are in the UK at the moment. Our last webinar, which is actually doing very well on the YouTube, was Am I High Functioning? Now, hopefully, we all know now that it is an outdated term. Forget about it. It's still really interesting to understand exactly what these terms were, why they existed, why do people still use them. Some of the terms we use today are also a little bit outdated. Some of them are official, others are not official, but if something is used, then it's worth understanding. It's one of the reasons why we're still adding new words to the dictionary, because if we do not, then there's going to be a whole heap of history that kind of gets forgotten about, or we don't really understand. Hopefully we understand the relevant. So today is, do I have a reading disorder? Maybe you don't. If you do, today's probably not going to open a whole can of worms, but what it will do is break down what they are, what are some of the characteristics, what are some of the symptoms, and how might we be able to work with them rather than against them? Now, my first question to kick off this discussion, which of these reading disorders are you familiar with? Dyslexia, hyperlexia, Alexia, reading comprehension deficit. These are like the key ones. There are arguably more depending on what books you look at. Some diagnostic books include, some do not. So it's a little bit vague. Okay, most of you dyslexia. Yep, that's what I would gather. Hyperlexia. This is one that people have heard of, but no one really knows what it means. Actually, hyperlexia is not an official term. It is just a useful term to describe a certain set of circumstances and symptoms. You're probably not ever going to be diagnosed with hyperlexia. Alexia, that is one which, while a lot of you, none of you have heard of, maybe if I give it by another name, you would have. Acquired dyslexia. A lot of the time when we talk about reading disorders, we are talking about neurodevelopmental. You're born with it. It's through your entire life. It's always part of you. But acquired is something that comes later on, maybe due to a brain injury, an accident, stroke, things like that. A reading comprehension deficit is similar to hyperlexia, but where hyperlexia is being above and beyond in reading, but struggling with comprehension, a reading comprehension deficit is like just being okay at reading and struggle with the comprehension. So there are little differences. Alexia sounds too much like me, like the Google Smart Assistant. Yeah, sorry if I've set anyone little home devices off. Honestly, Amazon has ruined that name now, and it's such a nice name. Oh, April says, I have just learned that Alexia is a hybrid of acquired and dyslexia. You're absolutely right, April. I know, I always quite a smart audience. I pride myself in that. Here we are. These are the 4 that we are going to be doing a little bit of a deep dive in today. Here's a quick quiz, right? And all you need to do is, when I do the questions, there's not a right or wrong answer. I just need you to make a little note on what is the answer. Is your answer A, B, or C? And at the end of it, we'll see which of these reading disorders do you most closely align to. This isn't diagnosing. It's just a bit of fun in order to see if there are characteristics you more closely align to. First of all, when reading, do you confuse similar words and letters? D's and B's, P's and Q's, all of that lovely stuff? Or do you read fast but understand nothing? Or do you find all reading difficult? Doesn't matter how you do it, it's just difficult. Or do you read words, but you often miss context, so you skip over bits and the brain isn't fully digesting it? Now, you could say, a little bit all of them. You've got to pick one, otherwise it doesn't really work. Let's say you pick A, just jot it down. Okay, A. Quite a balanced approach, actually. All right, next one, understanding jokes and metaphors, particularly in a written context. A good example is Christmas crackers. You pull them, you're happy, you got your little hat on, you read your joke, doesn't make sense to you. Maybe if someone was to verbally tell you, it makes sense, but reading it, not so much. Answers are struggling with misreading words. Because you're misreading words, the joke doesn't land. A dyslexic joke teller, hit and miss, may I say. As long as it's in the head, it's okay. But if they are reading it, I always ruin the joke. Jokes, it's all about the context that you do not see. It's that kind of hidden bit that makes it funny. Right over the head. Or do you just find it too difficult to read the words in general at all? Or the last one, you read absolutely fine, but you do find the interpretation tough. Okay, here we are. Oh, most of you have said struggle with misreading the words. Honestly, vein of my life. I like to think I'm a funny guy. I'm not funny when I'm reading things. I just screw it up. Sometimes that can be funny, but then the joke goes from the cracker to me. When learning new words, brand new words, you've never seen these words before, what would you choose? Do you find spelling / sounding out hard, or quick to read, onomatopoeia, slow to understand, trouble reading new words altogether? I'm not even going to attempt it. Or need context to understand. If you understand that the word is talking about sound and music, onomatopoeia, I understand it in that context. There are multiple different ways where you can have difficulty with the end result. This is why understanding the symptoms is really important rather than purely understanding the outcome. It's why I always talk about dyslexia and dyspraxia being similar. The root cause of how the brain gets to it, very different. And that can massively impact how you might support someone. When reading out loud, what do you do? Do you mispronounce and jumble words? Do you read well but comprehend less so you can read out loud? Other people understand you, but you don't understand yourself. I actually fall quite well into that box because I can read out loud, but I can't really enjoy the story at the same time. I'm either reading or I'm understanding, not really doing both. Do you struggle to read altogether? Or reading words, but you find it difficult to explain? You know, when people say those comprehension questions, what did Oliver do? And you're like, I read it, I understood it, but I'm not really able to two and two together. Okay, yeah, most of you have done it on that one. Recalling text details, this kind of expands upon the whole comprehension piece. If I were to ask you to go into it, would you mix up / forget words? Recall words, but not the meaning. I remember that the word was but I genuinely don't remember what it is, even though the text has already spoken about it. Do you struggle to read / recall whatsoever? Or do you remember words, just not the message? I know what the word means, I know what it says, but I can't really understand the context that it was originally put into. Vicky says, I usually read the words, but say them in the wrong order. Okay, your most common letter. Out of all the questions, which letter did you get the most of? Was it mostly A's, mostly B's, C's, D's? I don't know. If you weren't keeping count, that's your problem. Don't worry too much. Again, this is not a scientific thing. This is just a little bit of fun. Just pick one and go with it. A, B, C, or D. Do you know? Okay, everyone, I'm certain most of you didn't pick C, by the way. It was mostly A's and D's I was seeing. But whatever. If you got mostly A's, this indicate tendencies towards dyslexia. Dyslexia was mostly A's, then B suggests tendencies towards hyperlexia. C's were mostly indicated of Alexia. D pointed mostly towards reading comprehension deficits. Interestingly, dyslexia is how we see text, phonologics, and we process the pattern that makes it. If we understand the pattern, we can read the word. Hyperlexia is being able to read easy, but not really getting the context behind it. Typically, happens in early life rather than in later life. Then we have Alexia, which is mostly to do with acquired dyslexia. This is why most of you saying C, I'm like, probably not. The last one is a bit all and above. You're like, I'm not really sure where to put you. Reading comprehension. Oh yeah, too busy trying to process the questions. In a nutshell, dyslexia is difficulty with accurate and or fluent reading recognition, poor spelling and decoding abilities. However, You could also have hyperlexia. Now, some people think hyperlexia is a superpower. Haha, no. While you do have advanced learning and you are able to do things much sooner than your peers, just because you can do something doesn't mean you understand it. You might be able to read, but it doesn't mean you can really get the meaning behind it. Alexia, a loss of reading ability, usually due to brain damage. Again, very rare, but still worth noting. And reading comprehension deficit struggles with understanding the meaning of what is read, being able to pull it apart. If there's slight meanings, if there's subtle undertone, things that are alluding to, you may be struggling with those. Oh, we got Gregory says, interesting. If we have something like attention deficit, how much might that affect the results when we do tests for other things? That's the whole thing, Gregory. Like, these tests are not really that helpful. They're a useful exercise, but when you have the whole co-occurrence and intersectionality out the window, take this with a massive grain of salt. Oh, Daniela says, what is the big difference between hyperlexia and reading comprehension deficit? I am going to go into that, but the key thing is, while both of them are able to read fine, one is able to read much earlier on and at a much higher level, but both of them struggle with comprehension. Bev says, I fall between the dyslexia and the reading comp deficit. Not sure if that answers your question. I do see that you do have to take these into consideration, and do they skew the results a little bit? It's possible, but no one is a pure case. We all have a whole heap of things going on anyway. What is some history of reading disorder? Anyway, history of reading disorders. In the 18th century, 1896, Mr. Pringle. I don't know if it's the Mr. Pringle, like that guy with a mustache, but that's what I like to think of. He documented one of the first cases of dyslexia, describing a 14-year-old in Sussex with a reading difficulties. So yeah, not called dyslexia. We're getting there. Then in the dawn of the century, Scottish ophthalmologist James Hinzelwood published studies on congenital word blindness and early term for dyslexia. The word blindness is a word that comes up quite a lot in the history. It's not to do with eyesight. We didn't know that at the time. Then in the 30s and 40s, there's growing recognition of dyslexia in the UK, but at least I'm not getting possessed. Then in the 60s, the World Blind Centre for Dyslexic Children opened in London. We're talking the 60s, not that long ago, and we had a whole bloody centre for blind, even though we're talking about dyslexia. We are still on a very early journey. Then we got the 70s, the Dyslexic Association was founded with the awareness of reading disorders like alexia and hyperlexia. These terms were not common knowledge, but it's interesting that they were around the same time. Moving into the 80s, we had advances in neurology, a better understanding of alexia and how it relates to brain injuries rather than neurodevelopmental. Then almost in the 90s, but not quite, we had the Autism Dyslexia Society conference. This is where we had a bunch of smart people together, all talking and collaborating and doing research. We're really spearheading the movement. Then in the actual 90s, we had research into hyperlexia. Now, from the actually 80s to early 2010s, there was some really interesting around hyperlexia. But again, it is still not a recognized condition. It's more a helpful term. Then 2009, the Rose Report in England highlighted the need for early identification and support of dyslexia. Essentially, if you don't get it early on, it's going to rickle through time. It's much better to get support early on. 2010, development of technologies and teaching methods offer improved support for reading disabilities. Doing scans, we're doing tests, we've got systems and processes in place, and we've been able to prove that dyslexia is a real thing, not just from a psychological perspective, but from a neurological perspective. The important thing is, dyslexia has been around for a while, but understanding has not. What exactly is dyslexia? Dyslexia is challenges in word recognition, spelling, and decoding, often, but not always, linked to phonological processing difficulties. Because while dyslexia, when you are diagnosed, isn't really split up into subtypes, knowing about the different subtypes can be quite useful, because not everyone's dyslexia is the same. Now, I've split it into 7. Officially, maybe there's not 7. It really depends on who you are listening to. But let's break them down because I think they make sense. We've got phonological. This is how we process patterns. The English language is complicated. If you struggle with that, phonological. Surface dyslexia. Words like Fort, words that have silent letters that do not really work with phonologic. Forget about phonologics. You either know it or you don't know it. If you struggle with that, potentially surface dyslexia, very common in acquired dyslexia. Directional, you may struggle reading left or right to left. You know how like Japanese books are back to front in the Western perspective, you may struggle with that. Though you've got rapid name deficits, so if people are asking to recall things, particularly when you do those games where you have to do an associated word quickly, that is an area you may struggle in. Double deficit, this is when you might have multiple. Typically, it's phonological and rapid name deficit combined together. Visual dyslexia is where you get your letters muddled up, mixing around. When we're thinking stereotypical dyslexia, that's what we're thinking of. Graphic dyslexia, this is when you get your B's and your D's muddled up. When you think night as in K-N-I-G-H-T, but you might write it N-I-T-E. Not being able, struggling in those areas. I know, there's a lot of them in there. It's quite interesting. Are there any of these that you personally resonate with, even though your diagnosis probably is not going into this level of detail? Oh, Vicky says, my daughter is phonological, I think. I think my husband is more surface. He really struggles helping out children learn to read as he just can't understand or hear the phonological breakdown. See, that is interesting because it can vary depending on the person. You also might have multiple, so it's not one or the other, but it's more complicated than simply dyslexia full stop. Now, here's a question around dyslexia. So, do you mix up words, letters when reading and writing? If it's rarely, probably not dyslexia. If it's almost always, probably dyslexia. If it's somewhere in between, it could be either or. These are not a hard and fast rule. You could, for instance, not relate to ones that are related to dyslexia and still have dyslexia. So know that it's more nuanced than black and white. Then we've got hard to sound out words and letter combos. Are there any words that you are always getting mixed up? You struggle to sound out, you get, for instance, affect and effect. That's not to do with reading. That's about understanding the English language. Dog and God, different words, but always getting them muddled up. Then we've also got being able to read out words. If you have seen a word before, easy enough. Remember surface dyslexia. Surface dyslexia is when you struggle to remember words, but most people with dyslexia are able to remember words. I have phonological dyslexia. I struggle to break words down. But if I've seen the word before, so surface, I'm okay. If you get Lewis Carroll, we all love a little bit of Alice in Wonderland. What is he on about? Towards greening and the sliver trov did grov and glimble. You know, I don't know. Because these words we haven't seen before. They don't follow the patterns and the structure which we've come to expect. Most people would struggle with this. Those with dyslexia maybe struggle more, or maybe might find reading normally might be like reading the Jabberwocky. It's a lot easier. A quick overview of dyslexia. Difficulty in word recognition, spelling and decoding, not related to intelligence, often hereditary, means it runs in the family, requires specialist educational support. You do have to get a diagnosis in order to be diagnosed with it. Then again, you may just resonate, would still benefit from the support. Or we've got Vicky again. I studied language acquisition as part of my English A-level, and there were studies on children's phonological awareness using non-words such as Jabberwocky to test the children's understanding. They also use similar in dyslexic screeners in school. But now let's move on to hyperlexia. Again, is misunderstood. People think, oh, you know, I got a smart child, they have hyperlexia. No. Your child, I'm not saying they're not smart, I'm just saying there's more to it. So hyperlexia is exceptional word recognition, but, and this is a big but, with a lack of understanding or poor comprehension of text. You may pick up words really easy. You may be reading way before your peers, but that doesn't mean you're understanding it. Wow, how are they doing that? It just, we put it on them rather than what they're actually understanding. So hyperlexia, in 2011, before that, it was split into 3 sections. They're not often talked about, but I think it's quite interesting. So we've got type 1 is early readers, neurotypical. If you are someone who doesn't have dyslexia or autism, type 1 hyperlexia. You can be hyperlexic and not be neurodivergent. Interesting, right? Type 3 is the part related to autism. Even though hyperlexia is often connected with dyslexia, actually it's more related to autism, which is really interesting. So it's when you might have very precocious reading. And the last one is type 3, and this is advanced reading with autism-like traits, but not autism. Back in the day when we had all the old-fashioned diagnosis, maybe you might want to say type 3 was like Asperger's. Nowadays, you don't quite need the criteria, but it's in the middle. This is a relatively recent addition, which was coined by Donald Treathert. Moving swiftly on, let's find out how closely you relate to hyperlexia. Do you read easily but struggle with meaning? Does this sound like you? Someone who can read, like it's not even a big deal. The meaning, you're not even sure what you read. Really complex words, not an issue for you. The understanding, not so much. If that does sound like you, that is a hyperlexic characteristic. Doesn't mean you have it, just means it's a characteristic. Yeah, I know, damn dyslexia. I love it, but I hate it. It's a mixed bag. Okay, do I prefer reading over social interactions? Those who are hyperlexic typically would prefer reading because it has patterns, it has structure, it has a format that their brains are able to follow through. But social activities may not be their jam. Now, as I mentioned, it closely relates to autism, and this does too. People with autism typically prefer more isolated situations than collaborative ones. Not for all, but for some. You can see how there is a strong link here. Vicky says, I wouldn't say he's hyperlexic, but my son who is autistic, if that's relevant, just got reading really easily, but took much longer to actually read and understand. I would say that does sound like hyperlexia, but again, things are a spectrum. A quick summary of hyperlexia is advanced word recognition, way beyond most people, yet a poor meaning grasp. And when other people catch up your reading ability, you may still not really caught up with the meaning side. You may struggle with social interactions, non-literal language. So if you do any sort of, it's raining cats and dogs, that might be a real stickler for you. It's very common with autism spectrum. It's not a deficit, but it is very common. It's managed via language therapy and educational support. When you are just a little bab, 18 to 12 months, you may start reckon numbers and letters. You know, at 3, they start reading, potentially before 5. So you could be a 3-year-old and reading, and you're like, but then at age 4.5 to 6, you notice that there is a massive surge in their ability. Then at 8 and 10, when you would expect them to be way beyond their peers, you notice that while they are reading very well, understanding what they're reading. So it's interesting. The hyperlexia is easy to spot early on, but it's not really easy to confirm until quite a few years later. Now let's move on to lexia, because it is the most unknown one of them. That acquired dyslexia is the colloquial term. That's like what people call it on the streets. We start off with the overall arching dyslexia mother god. Then it normally breaks down. Typically, when we think of dyslexia, we're going down this little path and we go, oh, developmental. And these are genetics, these are hereditary, these are things that will be for your whole life. Typically, we are thinking of phonologics. This is what we typically think of when we think of dyslexia. The other type of dyslexia is acquired. And this could be stroke or head trauma, a whole wide range of things. Again, a lot less common, but is a thing. You might have deep dyslexia, which is semantic difficulties. This is when it comes like joining things. And surface dyslexia is sight words. Now, sight word difficulties is again seeing the word and knowing what it is straight away. The English language is particularly difficult for those with sight dyslexia. You've got these two words, and one of them on the acquired side is more visual based, and those who are more phonological based are more auditory. For instance, acquired dyslexia may struggle to read cat, because even though all of us have seen that word before and we remember it, someone with surface dyslexia or acquired would struggle. Yet someone with dyslexia would understand that word, but if they had to break it apart bit by bit, like into the raw sounds, that is when they may find it more challenging. So yeah, it's a bit of a complicated slide here, but I think the key takeaway is knowing that it breaks off into different elements. Now, here are some questions to see if whether or not it may be acquired dyslexia. Do you find it hard to understand text after a brain injury? Only if you've had a brain injury may you be able to answer this. I guess you could already have dyslexia, have a brain injury, and then have double dyslexia. It would be called that, but worth noting. Then, okay, do you struggle to link letters to words and can recognize C? You can recognize A, you can recognize T, but you can't recognize CAT. And this is really interesting again, because you might say individually, letters make sense to you, but you aren't able to join them together. and remember what they should be. Words like night and night, you do require a level of understanding of the English language, but words like cat, you don't have to break them down. They are what they are, but some people still struggle with that. So a quick summary of Alexia is a reading loss from brain injury or stroke, recognizing letters but can't form words. That is what we just spoke about. It is not linked to IQ. So it doesn't mean that you lose a couple of your marbles, not at all. And it does not relate to vision issues. So that is a key way of ruling that out. You may want to have rehab or therapy in terms of being able to help manage it. And it can go away after time, but also it may stick with you. Whereas your conventional bog standard out of the box dyslexia is with you for life. And this one can be diagnosed by neurologists and speech pathologists. Now, the very last one I want to talk about is reading comprehension deficit. So again, this, you don't fit into the dyslexia category, but you're still closely aligned. It's like the not otherwise specified category of autism. On here, you've got the kind of three things that make up dyslexia. Phonological, we've got the speed/naming deficit and the comprehension deficit. All of these, lovely dyslexia. Whereas reading comprehension deficit is just a comprehension deficit and the rapid naming and speed. It does not relate to phonologics. It's like you've got two pieces of the puzzle, not three pieces. You would still find a lot of elements of dyslexia strongly resonate with you, but you are finding reading completely fine. Again, sounds similar to hyperlexia, but this is probably more related to overall difficulty with comprehension and naming and not related to age or related to autism. Yes, walking the walk, almost talking the talk. Can I read words correctly, but often don't understand what I read? Here's a little thing to find out which one you have. Let's say dyslexia. You have good language comprehension, but poor word recognition. So dyslexia. Maybe you have mixed disabilities. Hyperlexia would be good word recognition, but poor language comprehension. Now, when it comes to reading comprehension, you might think, where would it fit on this little graph? I would say reading comprehension goes on this line here. It's not that you have really great word recognition, like hyperlexia is probably great word recognition. You're probably a bit more like here. How I find it hard to follow narrative or arguments in text. Do you find it difficult when you're trying to see, are someone being positive or negative, or are they trying to illustrate a point? And this comes down to, again, it's not about reading, it's all about understanding. So you can see the very clear difference here. Then we've got the simple understanding of what reading is. Do I frequently need to reread sentences or paragraphs to grasp the meaning? And this is how we break up reading. You've got decoding. So you're looking at the text. Okay, so the code has made the word cat. I understand cat is a meow fluffy creature. That is the comprehension. When you combine the coding and the comprehension together, that is when we've got reading. So you use this little puzzle to work out. Some people struggle with the coding, some people struggle with the language comprehension, some people struggle with both. But if you've got all of them in a nice little package, then you've got reading. Now, just to finish up on this one, reading comprehension deficit is difficulty understanding text despite good reading. Struggles with main ideas and details caused by factors like vocabulary, memory, affecting academics, reading enjoyments, managed with intervention, specialist support, and diagnostic need assessments. As you can see here, very much relates to what we think dyslexia is. It's not really factoring the phonological part. It's just two pieces of it. Oh, let's see what any comments here. We got, I think people often understand what someone else wrote precisely because they don't comprehend what was written down actually said. Interesting take. As always, we do assessments. If any of you do have reading difficulties, challenge, deficits, disorders, whatever you want to call them, there is support in the workplace. Thankfully, for conditions that are similar to dyslexia or reading challenges, there are a whole heap of support, strategies, equipment, mentoring, coaching, which can be beneficial. Do get in contact with exceptional individuals if that does sound like you. Here are some lovely references if you're like, I would love to learn more about reading disorders, which of course you do. You've got to appreciate the irony here. If you are interested in reading disorders, there's a high likelihood you may have a reading disorder, but the format in terms of understanding it more is completely inaccessible. Ugh, the irony of dyslexia. Now, any last questions on this subject? Any thoughts, opinions, clarifications? Now is your time to ask them. Okay, we've got what about returning to university? Absolutely, you can. I've returned to university, finishing my master's, 5 weeks left. And then I can retire, live a happily life in the country. Oh, nice you're doing your MA too. That's amazing to hear, Bev. All right, if any of you do have any questions, let me know after. Ask whenever you like. Our next webinar, if you enjoyed today, was looking at neurodivergent jobs. What jobs are perfectly suited for those with non-typical neurology, for those who fit out of the status quo, those who you cannot put neatly in a box? Are there certain jobs which more closely align to where your brain connects the dots? Or is it tough luck? We've done a similar one on dyslexic jobs years ago, and I wanted to look a bit more broadly on what jobs cherish support innovation, but also make sure there is additional support available should someone need it. Look, all these lovely little videos booming at the moment. Do subscribe. Oh, look at that. Here we come. We got a little Facebook group if you do have autism. Also one on dyslexia. We've got online quizzes and characteristics. Use these as a starting point, okay? These are not diagnosing anyone. The amount of emails we get every week about people saying, you diagnosed me. No, we did not. Read the text or listen to me now. Okay, rant over. If you are interested, get in contact, x.com. We have a whole heap of resources and admin exceptional individuals. Get in contact with our lovely team who will be able to support you with any questions, concerns, or queries. Okay, I've done my daily amount of talking for the day, so let's leave it as that. And I hope you found it interesting and educational, and hopefully see you next week or the following weeks to come. Coming up with some ideas of what jobs may suit my neurodivergent 15-year-old. I'm hoping it will be useful. Is Alexia really only diagnosed when children are older? Hyperlexia is only talked about when a child is younger. When they're an adult, you don't get hyperlexia. But with Alexia, I suppose at any age you could have a brain injury. I suppose it'd be quite difficult to diagnose it early on because you have to have had something and then lost it in order for it to be diagnosed. And if you had never gained those skills in the first place, I suppose it'd be quite difficult. But good question. All right, nice. We are all good today, everyone. Go off. Enjoy the rest of your day. Yep, see you soon.